The law for crimes against the king in late medieval England was a form of execution. When one thinks of medieval European history, one thinks of horrible torture and methods of execution. Some crimes demanded a harsh punishment. In fact, even death was considered too little for them. One such crime is treason. Let me be clear. In late medieval England, those who committed this crime could only be sentenced to death after a series of tortures. Then, they would be killed. The offender would first be dragged and then killed in a place visible to the public. Then, their internal organs or male genitals are cut off and burned in a fire. And finally, they are beheaded. Some of these tortures date back to Roman times. However, it was not until the late Middle Ages during the reign of Edward the Sirch that they were brought together and systematized. He employed this method particularly in his invasions of Wales and Scotland. In his time, this practice almost became a ritual. Indeed, period sources even ascribed a specific meaning to each stage of this execution. This clearly indicates that the suspect is also accused of various crimes, including theft and murder. There is no doubt that the feudal system was the driving force behind the use of this brutal form of execution. Kings sought to assert their authority and demonstrate the grandeur of their power to the masses. Let me be clear. The target of this execution was the nobility, not the common people or common criminals. However, it is clear that despite these executions, the problems have not been solved, and deterrence was not effective. Nevertheless, this form of execution continued until the early 19th century, albeit with decreasing frequency. In the late Middle Ages, kings definitively ended the political disorganization of the feudal structure and centralized power. As they struggled to establish governments, they resorted to harsh practices. They had done so. One of these was the British law against crimes against the king, which was a form of execution. It involved dragging, hanging, dismemberment, and exposure. It is certain that its roots go back to Rome. Let me be clear. In those times, a crime against the emperor and the country was considered the worst crime. Therefore, the death penalty, which is applied for many crimes, is not sufficient in this case. The offender should be sentenced to death. Ways were sought to make it much more severe. In the Middle Ages, especially in England, this form of execution, of which we have seen brutal examples, was gradually phased out. However, it continued to exist, albeit sporadically, until 1820. After that date, it ceased to exist. From the jurist Glanville, who lived during the reign of Henry II, 1154-1189, we know for certain that the term lese majesty was used for this type of offense. Glanville and he used this term for that period. This was a crime of such magnitude that even if the person does not commit the offense in question, but only intends or contemplates it, they are still guilty. This idea was also adopted in late medieval England. The crime of treason is not considered a crime against the person, but is in fact the most serious crime. This required a special punishment. This crime warranted a special method of execution for anyone who committed it, even royalty. Henry III made it law. He had a legal basis for it. The punishment was severe. The person could be subjected to violence, such as scalping or disemboweling. It is clear from period records that the punishment for treason was severe. In fact, it is said that the guilty would have been shown more mercy in hell after death if they had the opportunity to express themselves. Glanville was influenced by Roman law and also drew on canon law in his interpretations. He believed that those who committed this crime should either be executed outright or have their arms and legs amputated. This was the idea of killing by cutting and inflicting pain. Furthermore, the punishment included the confiscation of his property and the denial of inheritance to his heirs. The following are examples of executions in the UK. In the mid-13th century, the first systematic punishment for the crime of treason was introduced. William Marsh, during the reign of Edward I's father, Henry III, was a knight who brazenly set aside his loyalty to the king and took up piracy for various reasons of his own. Matthew Paris's chronicle states that he did not stop there. He also attempted to assassinate the king. William was captured by the king's men in 1242 and brought to London, where he was imprisoned. On St. James's Day, he and 16 accomplices were tried and executed in the most ignominious manner. The prisoner was taken from Westminster to the Tower of London for execution. He was hanged on a gallows and kept waiting until he died. From this, we can be sure that he was hanged by the arms, not by the throat. Once he was dead, they lowered him down. He was then disemboweled, and his internal organs were removed and burned on the spot. His body was cut into 4 and sent to 4 important cities for exhibition. Matthew Paris states that William had 16 of his men dragged behind horses and hanged on the gallows. However, he makes no mention of their disemboweling and dismemberment. Matthew Paris's narrative is the only source that mentions this event, which raises questions about its purpose. It was used as both a precaution and a punishment even before Henry III. There were a number of procedures involving the amputation of certain organs. Henry I cut off the right hands of usurers, for example. Henry II, c. 1154-1189, was responsible for the brutal punishment of many Welsh people, including the cutting off of male genitals and the blinding of children. Women were also subjected to severe mutilation, with their noses and ears being cut off. However, there is no known example of such a punishment as that meted out to William Marsh. However, the execution was carried out in a crowded city like London in other records, which proves that Matthew Paris made it up and brought it to the world. However, we are convinced that this type of execution was not common practice at the time. Matthew is not sufficiently recorded outside of Paris due to the lack of practice. Furthermore, this form of execution was not tolerated by the church. Indeed, Magna Carta withstood resistance from the barons for another half a century. However, the practices of powerful kings, such as Edward I, made it more customary. This is why, during his reign, the dragus/dismemberment method of execution became a ritual rather than an ordinary and gruesome method. We believe that the key reason Edward turned this process into a ritual was to deflect attention from the political turmoil and its ruthless character. It is a simple fact that various nobles and princes who had obtained various rights through treaties and rebellions wanted to act much more independently during his reign. From 1268 until 1272, when his father died, Edward was away on the crusade. Upon his father's death, he returned and took the throne. Upon his ascension to the throne, the barons demanded that he swear to 3 things. He pledged firstly to uphold the Magna Carta, secondly to resist papal interference in all matters, and thirdly to ensure fair trials. Edward never forgot his oath, and he took steps to protect the rights of his kingdom. He appointed sheriffs to represent him all over the country and sent officials. He aimed to gain the loyalty of the people, rich and poor alike. This demonstrates the significance he placed on the recognition of his authority and the consolidation of power. It is evident that he was acutely aware of the necessity to maintain the integrity of the administration. He was determined to do whatever it took to achieve this. Those who rebelled were executed in a ritualized manner. Turning it into a propaganda tool was a clear manifestation of this sensitivity. The king's executions were a crucial move to protect his person in the eyes of the people. They were regarded as an activity in the public interest, not as an attempt to Edward use this form of execution to gain control of Wales and Scotland. Defied and William Wallace were instrumental in this process. Wales was never united under a single government. It came under the control of England and continued to struggle throughout the 13th century, determined not to enter the Ottoman Empire. King Edward III, in 1275, at the age of 36, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he solved this problem once and for all by invading the Principality of Wales. Meanwhile, the brother of Prince Llywelyn of Wales, Dafydd, initially sided with him, but later turned against Edward to fight for independence. Edward emerged victorious from this struggle and took Dafydd prisoner in June 1283. Edward, following in his father's footsteps, treated Dafydd differently to punish them. He decided to use a process of dragging, hanging, and smashing, and designed an execution composition. We are including a commentary for each stage in the Lanarcost Chronicle. The king is convinced Dafydd is a traitor, so he has him dragged on the ground and hanged on a gallows like a thief. Dafydd's head was then severed from his body, disemboweled and burned in a fire. The final execution was carried out, and then, because he was a rebel, his arms and legs were removed from his body and left. The next step was to publicize this event to those who could not witness the execution. Each organ was to be displayed in the square of an important city. His right arm with the ring on it was sent to York, his left arm to Bristol, his right leg to Northampton, and his left leg was sent to Hereford. The head was exhibited in London for a long time. The head is kept in an iron cage to prevent the pieces from falling apart after decomposition. This iron cage was also supported by a long iron rod. We do not know if Edward carried out any other such executions on the Welsh front. In the north, during the invasion of Scotland, this execution was again invoked. It certainly did. By the end of the 18th century, England had brought Scotland to its knees. The Scottish nobles were determined to resist, but one of them admitted they couldn't go on. This was the task of a small landowner, 26 years old and 2 meters taller than his son, William Wallace. From Blind Harry, who lived 150 years later, we know that William Wallace was attacking the British for personal reasons. He was then attacked by the English sheriff, Ad in Heselrigg, for murdering his wife, Marion of Lanark. This sparked a Scottish-English war. This information is generally based on the Forden account, which John confirms. William Wallace had already made significant achievements at the beginning of the war. For example, in 1297, the Scots inflicted a significant defeat on the English in their battle at Stirling Bridge. The English advanced against the Scots for 8 years, despite the Scots' initial successes. At last, in 1304, Edward broke the Scottish resistance and captured William Wallace. Edward was the man who had humiliated him in the eyes of his people and been his biggest problem for years. He would not kill him easily. He had developed a method to apply to William Wallace and destroy his reputation in London and kill him. Here, he was subjected to a perfunctory trial in which his crimes were listed. Then came the execution. He was dragged through the streets of London. He was then hanged by the neck on the gallows until he died. Then his male organs were cut off, and with that, his intestines were removed. Then the organs were burned in the fire, right then and there, separate from his body. Finally, all the big ones that had been declared outlaws were beheaded like criminals. We do not know which of these tortures Wallace died from. However, he did not die until after his head had been severed from his torso. This was the death of a man who had been beheaded. Once his head had been severed, the rest of his body was cut into 4 pieces and distributed. While his head was displayed on London Bridge, his organs were used in the various towns where he lived. His right arm was sent to Newcastle, and his left arm to Berwick. His feet were amputated, unlike Dafydd, who had his legs cut off. His right foot was sent to Perth, and his left foot was sent for display in Stirling. I would like to draw your attention to one point. Let me be clear. William Marsh's execution is not the same as the above-mentioned execution. As we know, it's not a very common method, so only Matthew Paris in the Chronicle. However, William Wallace's execution is explicitly mentioned in all the chronicles of the period. This method of execution was already known. Furthermore, William Wallace had numerous lovers and detractors alike. Undeniably, he was a prominent figure in Scottish history. This is why the manner of his death was recorded in the late 19th century. In the reign of Edward II, this form of execution continued to be practiced. People were executed. The most famous execution during this period was carried out on someone close to Edward II. Period sources confirm that Edward II's homosexual intimacy with the state and their influence on government affairs were well known. It is reported that he was deeply hated by those in power. One of the most hated men was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser had gone so far in his actions that he was now showing the barons of England what he was capable of. Isabella, Edward's wife, successfully convinced the barons that her brother, the King of France, with the support of Charles IV and his lover Mortimer, she took decisive action against her husband. In 1327, she succeeded in deposing him and replacing him with her son Edward, Prince of Wales. Hugh Despenser was captured trying to escape and taken to Hereford on a miserable horse. After a feast was held here, his crimes were read to him in front of everyone. The barons and knights then made the unanimous decision to punish him in the harshest way possible. The obvious method was selected. First, he was dragged through the streets of Hereford and brought to the main square of the city. At the same time, trumpets were played to make the event more conspicuous. The people gathered in the square. He was standing on a high ground so that everyone could see him, tied to a ladder. A huge fire was lit in the square. Then, they eviscerated him and cut off his phallus. He was a heretic and a sodomite, even with the king. And he did. That is why the king distanced himself from his wife, Isabella. The amputated organs were set alight and hurled into the flames. Then they removed his heart and threw him into the fire. He was an evil traitor. The king betrayed the country. He was beheaded and sent to London. His body was also quartered and sent to England's 4 major cities. By 1330, the same decision would be made regarding one of those who had ordered the execution of Hugh Despenser. The young king reached the age of 18 and promptly dismissed his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, who had been dismissed from their roles as regent and advisor. He had Mortimer brought to London. He promptly established a perfunctory court, which ruled that Mortimer deserved the same fate as Hugh Despenser. After a brief and perfunctory trial, he was convicted of complicity and swiftly executed on the streets of London. He was dragged, hanged on the gallows for 3 days, and then his heart, including his internal organs, was cut off and burned. Finally, he was quartered. Richard II, 1377-1399, used this form of execution a lot to the people of the city in the late 14th century. Adam Usk's chronicle states that a large number of rebels were executed in this way during the tax revolts that took place during Richard II's reign. These chronicles, like those of Lanercost and Froissart, state that the Mujahmin were dragged and burned in the fire. Alternatively, they were divided into 4 parts. However, Walsingham's chronicle provides a detailed account of the execution of John Ball, one of the leaders of the rebellion. In 1381, John Ball was captured and brought back to London. He was brought before a perfunctory court and subsequently sentenced to death. This method of execution was used in his execution. They were dragged, hung, held, decapitated, eviscerated, and finally cut into 4 pieces. Subsequently, William Grindcob and William Cadington, approximately 15 gang leaders, were executed in the same manner. It is only through examples that we can truly understand the causes. The names we have mentioned so far are just a few of the many noteworthy examples of this practice. We have already discussed how this form of execution was transformed into a ritual and what each action in this ritual signifies. In our view, these examples provide sufficient insight for us to comment on the ritual. Schechner is clear that this ritual is a combination of fun and function. King Edward I was quite clear that the theatricality of the execution was to ensure the message was effective. He wanted to increase the impact of the message and make an impression on the population. It is a common misconception that treason is a single offense. In fact, it can include a number of different major crimes, and the content of the execution process varies accordingly. From what we can ascertain from the examples, it is clear that those who are sentenced to this punishment are usually the victims of rebellion, or they are noble persons who have been at the forefront of treason. This punishment is designed to strip him of his nobility by subjecting him to a severe and humiliating punishment. Furthermore, the criminal's body is punished as a symbol of the crime, making him serve his country and king. The criminal is then transported from their place of imprisonment to the place of execution, which is usually the most central part of the city. The Lanercost Chronicle makes it clear that the purpose of the dragging is to betrayal. Indeed, the devaluation of money by clipping it and forging the king's seal is also considered treason. Those who committed such crimes were punished by being dragged and hanged on a gallows. A horse was typically used for this purpose. The route was also lined with spectators, ensuring the noble class saw to it that the offender's honor was completely destroyed. Hugh Despenser was even taken to his execution on a poorly maintained and weak horse, in a further act of indignity. Furthermore, the ground is stony and unsuitable for those with disabilities, causing immense pain and suffering. By the time they reached the execution site, they were begging for mercy. The second process in executing the accused is to place him on a gallows or hang him from a high place. The suspect is hanged by the arms or the throat. This is how Wallace was executed. However, the offender is still alive when hanged by the throat, and thus experiences the suffering that follows. The Lanercost Chronicle describes hanging as a punishment for thieves. We are convinced that the rebel seizure of a part of the country is at least a form of theft, which is worthy of punishment. The most excruciating and gruesome stage of the execution was the disemboweling and the amputation of the male genitalia. From the narratives, we can infer that the offender has reached this stage to ensure that he dies after the execution, as was the case with the execution of Defied and William Marsh. This was also done after the offender had been killed. The Lanercost Chronicle states that this punishment was in reference to the offender being an arsonist or murderer. The same is true of the Peter Langtoft Chronicle, which also states that the male genitalia was amputated as a punishment for sinfulness. The Froissart Chronicle is by Hugh. The description of Despenser's execution states that the amputation of his phallus is proof of his homosexual relationship during the war. Once more, Froissart's chronicle records that Roger Mortimer was executed with his heart removed because he was a rebel. After removing the intestines and amputating the male organs, they were incinerated. If the offender is still alive, he is made to witness the incineration process. The goal is to psychologically terrorize the offender. There are many different interpretations of cremation. This punishment has been used in all cultures in Europe since the 12 Tables laws of the Roman period. The Romans used this form of execution for arsonists. The same punishment is found in Germanic tribes. They practiced witchcraft and adultery. This is how they punished arson, poisoning, and theft. In the Christian community, burning was a form of execution for apostates. This was a punishment for the sinful soul. Some people in the comments said it was a way of punishing criminals for dishonoring society. In the first two examples mentioned above, the criminal's head is separated from the body before he is taken out. This form of execution has become a ritual. In Wallace's execution, the separation of the head from the body was left for later. If the criminal had not died by this point, this final act would undoubtedly have ended his suffering. However, the execution was not over. In the final stage, the body was dismembered and sent to various cities, where it was exhibited in the biggest squares. This is clearly intended to intimidate anyone who might consider a similar attempt in the future. Indeed, this process continued until the organ rotted and fell off. Even after Defied's head rotted, it was kept in a cage for a while to prevent it from falling apart and exhibited. The head of the perpetrator is usually exhibited in London. The arms and legs are sent to the largest cities. At the execution of William Wallace, his organs will be sent to the Scottish cities that received them originally. Transportation. Conclusion. In Europe, the political fragmentation brought about by the feudal system often led kings to fight against it. It is evident that this struggle commenced following William the Conqueror. It manifested itself much more harshly in the UK, without a doubt. The most important consequence was the Barons' War that took place at that time. Furthermore, the kings of England had to contend with these internal disturbances. In addition to being at war with the Scots in the north, the Welsh in the west, and the French in the southeast. In this process, the kings of England moved forward with one clear goal: to consolidate their rule on the island. They developed extremely gruesome methods for the execution of incoming rebels. These methods were not initially accepted and were considered brutal. It is clear that the first sources do not provide much detail about the event itself. He made it clear that the culprit had been killed in a very painful way. However, after Edward the Fern, this situation changed and became more normalized. Furthermore, kings devised new methods of execution. They did not stop there. They also went beyond physical intimidation and charged those who rebelled against the king with common crimes. They have identified them. This interpretation is supported by a range of sources from the period. This reinforces the idea that it was not only to execute the offender. In conclusion, it is clear that the aim was not simply to execute the criminal. It was also to prevent him from being regarded as a hero by identifying him with petty criminals and ruining his reputation.